So again, perception does make a difference, and if you only know one side of the story, it creates a perception. Now, going back to the historical view of this, what we rarely recognize today is that, as I mentioned, this is our second time to be in this region of the world fighting Muslim terrorists, and in the first time, we spent 32 years being at war with Muslim terrorists. It was called the Barbary Powers War, and we rarely hear about that in textbooks today. But that war against Muslim terrorists began at the end of the American Revolution, and it went through 4 different presidencies. President George Washington, President John Adams, President Thomas Jefferson, and President James Madison all had to fight against Muslim terrorists during their administrations. And it was a situation where that at the time of the American Revolution, there was international law that had been established for centuries. Legal writers like Grotius and Pufendorf and others had helped establish international law, and all the nations kind of got along in that international law. And international law said, well, when you're out in the open seas belong to everybody, and here's the amount of miles off your shore that belongs to you. These are your territorial waters, but once you get out in the deep seas, that everybody's got access to that. And that was the way it had been in international law forever. Well, American ships had been sailing to Europe, and they'd been sailing throughout the Mediterranean and sailing into Russia, who was an ally with us at that time. And a lot of our economy in the United States was based on shipping and commerce. We would trade what we had in America to other nations, and these commerce ships sailing back and forth. And what happened was, as we would go into these Mediterranean regions, and the Mediterranean Sea joined so many of these Islamic nations, as we went into that region, the American ships, for flying an American flag, were the object of attack by particularly five different Muslim nations. 5 different Muslim nations would come after American ships and didn't care that we were in international waters, didn't matter that there was international law. They went after the American ships and they attacked the American ships. And what they would do is they would capture the American sailors, the American crew, and they would imprison them, and they would make slaves out of them. As a matter of fact, just this morning, we purchased a newspaper. Now, we're very blessed. We have about 100,000 documents from before 1812, and this morning we added another one, and it was a newspaper from Boston, and it's a newspaper way back at the time of the early presidents, Madison, Washington, those. And it's a report of one of the guys who's just been captured by these Muslim terrorists. He was a sailor on a ship, and it was a ship that sailed out of Salem, Massachusetts. And so he's on the ship, and they were doing commercial trade. And by the way, when they got attacked by these Muslim terrorists, these commercial ships couldn't defend themselves. I mean, commercial ships might carry 3 or 4 cannons on their ship. They didn't need to defend themselves. Everybody recognized international law. They would use these cannons to fire off powder charges in the fog to make sure that other ships knew they were around. But, really defending themselves, that's not what the cannons are for. You didn't need to defend yourself as a commercial sailing ship. You were not a military ship, and that's fine. You can go through waters. But suddenly they'd get attacked by these 40-gun frigates and these 60-gun frigates and these corvette ships that the Muslims had, and would come after these commercial ships, and there was just no contest, no way to defend themselves. So in this one particular letter, and by the way, the Muslim terrorists back then were attacking Americans because they said the Americans are Christians, we're Muslims, we're supposed to attack Christians. And so here's the letter. It came out of the Boston Patriot newspaper, and it is from a man named Francis Garcia, and he's writing his dear wife. It's dated September the 1st. I'll just read you a couple lines out of this. He says, "My dear wife," and he tells her that on the 26th of August they were captured by an Algiers, one of the Muslim nations, a ship from them, that they were stripped of all their clothing. And he said, "We're now under the severe lashes of a taskmaster and full of filth and misery." He said, "To see Captain Smith, who's unused to labor, with a heavy burden on his back, as well as myself, doubles the misery of my captivity." He said that they're required to dig stones and drag those huge stones to the arsenal for the Muslims. He said at night, he said, "We retire to this dismal cell where we hear nothing but curses and the like." He said, "We sleep in the rocks and the mire." He went on to say that he talked to the Swedish Council, and he said the Swedish Council has given us some money to buy a second shirt, and he's given us an encouragement that the United States will not forget us. He says, "But as for me, there's no need of any assistance, for death will soon relieve me. But I pray, for Jesus' sake, that some means may be used for those who may survive." He says, "As for ever seeing you again, my dear wife," he said, "it will be in that eternal world where sorrow, I hope, will be quite banished from my troubled mind. He said, I die in the hope of the promises of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that He will present us unspotted before His Father. Farewell, all my friends. Farewell, all my relations. Farewell, Salem, Massachusetts. Farewell, America. And last of all, farewell to you, my dear. I remain your loving husband, Francis Garcia. Now that was a letter from one of these sailors who had been captured by the Muslim terrorists who managed, the letter managed to make it back to America. And while the Muslim terrorists would enslave these Americans, they soon found out that, if we will just simply take them, not necessarily enslave them, if we'll sell them back to America for ransom, this is a money-making deal. And so they continued to capture the Americans, and any ship that wore an American flag they would attack. And they started selling the captains back to America for $6,000, the officers for $4,000, and the sailors for $1,500 a head. And that equates, buying a ship back would be about $1 million today. It's about $1 million ransom to buy the crew back off of a ship. And so that's how these Muslim terrorists were financing what they were doing. They were doing this to America. Now, you look at that and say, well, why didn't America do something about it? Real simple. We're in the American Revolution. We don't even have a Navy. How are we going to do anything? I mean, the British Navy was our Navy. We've managed to convince the French to lend us their Navy, but we don't have a Navy. So with these commercial American sailing ships sailing all over the world, how do you defend them? Well, you can't, because we don't have a Navy. So if you can't be defended, when they attack and steal all these Americans and either enslave them or hold them for ransom to sell back, the only option you got is pay the ransom or let them remain in slavery or be killed. Nothing else you can do. Well, this was becoming such a frequent occurrence on American ships that in 1784, the Continental Congress, now remember, we finished the American Revolution in 1783, but in 1784, the Continental Congress said, we've got to do something to try to negotiate with these Muslim terrorists. So what they did in 1784 was Congress dispatched the first 3 diplomats to negotiate with these Muslim terrorists. Those 3 diplomats were Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Ben Franklin. They arrived over in Europe. They're dealing particularly with 5 Islamic nations that are attacking American interests, and they're trying to reach some type of accord with these guys. And so here these 3 Americans are negotiating with 5 different nations, and one of the ambassadors, one of the Muslim ambassadors with whom they negotiated, and by the way, 3 guys having to cover 5 nations, they had to travel back and forth between the nations a lot, and Adams and Jefferson managed to develop a relationship with one of these Muslim negotiators. And after 2 years of negotiating with this guy, they finally felt comfortable enough to ask him some very candid questions. I mean, we're beyond the diplomatic stage now. We just got to figure out how you think. So help us here. So Adams and Jefferson asked him some questions, and the answers to those questions they recorded and wrote down and sent back to the United States State Department. Those documents are still at the State Department. You can actually see the documents online. But Jefferson and Adams asked this Muslim negotiator a very simple question. They said, we really don't understand why all the unprovoked attacks on all these American interests. And we've done nothing to you guys. We've had no bad relations with Muslim nations. We certainly have never attacked you in any way. Why are you attacking us? Why all these unprovoked attacks? And here's the answer given by the Muslim ambassador to Jefferson Adams. And again, this is the answer that's in the State Department records. Quote, the ambassador answered us that it was founded on the laws of their prophet Muhammad, that it was written in their Koran that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, and that it was their right and their duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise.